Yes, thank you, Antti, for the introduction, and thanks everyone for really great presentations today. Thanks for inviting me to be part of this conference. Can you hear me okay? All right, great. And now I'll try and share my screen. Please, if you would be able to let me know if you can see it, that would be great. Let's put it on full screen then. All right, can you see my presentation?
Very well.
All right,
Go
great.
on.
Sweet. Okay, so yeah, my name is Ivan Sergejev, and I'm the coordinator of the Just Transition process at the Ministry of Finance in the Republic of Estonia. I mean, there was a lot spoken today about the European Green Deal, like the energy transition. I will not be discussing that as much, and I will instead focus on the specificities of preparing the Just Transition plan in Estonia. Just a quick overview to start of where we are at with our climate goals. Basically, I mean, we're on track. Estonia has been the member of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change since 1994. We've also ratified the Paris Agreement. We've accepted all the European Union's climate goals, the climate neutrality goals specifically. And we're currently on track with meeting our climate goals, as you can see from the graph. What you can also see is that the energy sector is by far the most CO2 intensive sector in Estonia. So the transformation of this sector specifically will influence how we will be doing over the next 29 years, how let's say, rocky or smooth our transition towards climate neutrality is going to be. But overall, we're making progress. Won't go into specifics of that too much, but we're doing quite okay as far as we understand. But we do have to update, obviously, a lot of strategic documents since the projections and the calculations that have been made even 2 years ago, let's say, are out of date by now. So I think we're all facing that challenge currently. But the impact of the transition towards climate neutrality will have a specifically strong influence, or the transition to climate neutrality will impact mostly, or the hardest, one specific region in Estonia, which is called Ida-Virumaa. It is the easternmost, mostly Russian-speaking region of Estonia. And if we take a look at the statistics of CO2 emissions from 2019, then we will see that the oil shale related companies, oil shale is used for electricity production, for fuel production. Oil shale related companies in the region account for over 50% of Estonians' total greenhouse gas emissions. So you can see that the transition to climate neutrality will have, and is already having, the largest impact specifically on this region. So what is the region that we're talking about? So here it is. You can see Estonia, and then the easternmost, let's say like the top left region of Estonia is Ida-Virumaa. It is not a very big region. It's about maybe 75 kilometers length, 50 width, let's say. But it's located in a very interesting area. Specifically, it's only about 100 or 150 kilometers away from St. Petersburg, which, as we know, is Russia's one of the biggest Russian metropolises. And also Tallinn is about 150, depending on where in Ida-Viru you drive from, but 150 to 200 kilometers away from Tallinn. So it's right there on the border between the European Union and Russia, which is kind of a big deal. If we zoom in and take a look at the Google Maps illustration of, or let's say map of Ida-Viru region, you can see from space that the oil shale sector extraction and also processing has influenced the very landscape of Ida-Viru pretty strongly. For example, if you look at the, at let's say the eastern part, you can see the open mining scars left on the territory of the region. Also the ash mountains that are left after the oil shale is used up for electricity production. A quick overview of what we're talking about when we talk about Ida-Viru. The population is not very high, so it's just under 134,000 people, although it has been declining steadily and pretty rapidly over the last 30 years. In the 90s, we had over 200,000 people living in the area. So the demographic trends, similarly to Poland, to Silesia region, are not looking very well. The economy, well, not too diverse. There are relatively more larger employers in the area than in the rest of Estonia, which has its impact on the, let's say, the entrepreneurial aspects of the region. Not a lot of entrepreneurs over there. Incomes in Ida-Viru are among the lowest nationally, except in the oil shale sector, which obviously makes it very difficult for the employees of the oil shale sector to move. They're being paid pretty much 50% more than the rest of the population in Ida-Viru. And so, of course, it's not like they're, screaming in excitement about leaving the oil shale sector. However, we have to deal with it, as we all know. Unemployment rate in Ida-Viru is also the nation's one of the nation's highest. Relative poverty, same thing. But another interesting aspect is that only is under 20% of the local population are actually native Estonians. So most people speak Russian language. The oil shale sector in Ida-Viru region has been there since 1920s or even earlier, and it's been, let's say, strategically important for Estonia since 1920s. And in 2019 accounted for about 5% of total national economy, about 2.5% of total employment. The interesting part is that the employees in the sector make up about 13% of total employment, but the taxes paid for them are almost twice as high, right? So 25% of labor taxes paid for them in the region. So you can see that the discrepancy in taxes is related to the discrepancy in incomes. The sector is undergoing major transition. So since 2080, when almost 14,000 people worked just in mines alone, we are currently seeing about 5,000 people in the sector generally, which is pretty well illustrated by this graph. The transition is ongoing in Ida-Viru. It's nothing new, unfortunately. And the transition has been ongoing both as a result of our climate agreements or climate goals, but also as the result of technological advancement in the sector. But it's obvious that the line only goes one way, and we need to do something about it. But also has or lends a certain complexity to the region and to the transition towards climate neutrality in Ida-Virumaa is that the local community has not actually yet fully recovered from the identity crisis and the emotional trauma that followed the collapse of the Soviet economy some 30 years earlier. Ida-Viru has been built up after the Second World War. Ida-Viru region has been built up as an industrial region. And so you can imagine, and as you maybe noticed from the decrease in our CO2 emissions, the CO2 emissions dropped really rapidly in the beginning of the 90s. And that's basically the result of all the industry that was built up in the Soviet era collapsing. And so when we're dealing with this new transition, we need to be mindful of the transition that was there 30 years ago and which is still influencing the local community. So we do need to get this one right. The impacts of the transition, I don't think I have to tell you, they're all over the board. So basically, the transition influence has a cascading economic effect on the entire economy of the region. It has impact on employment, on career and training opportunities. It has an impact on the feeling of social security, on migration choices, obviously, but it also has the impact on the reputation of the region, both locally and throughout Estonia. So as Ida-Viru is not a unique region in the sense of having challenges transforming into a climate neutral or stepping into the climate neutral economy, as we all know, a year ago, the European Union decided to establish a dedicated fund, which is called the Just Transition, or a dedicated mechanism, let's say, which is called the Just Transition Mechanism, in order to help regions like this, regions like Ida-Viru throughout European Union, to address the social, employment, economic, and environmental impacts of the transition towards our climate goals. So, as obvious from what I described before, in the context of Estonia, the Just Transition Mechanism territory is Ida-Viru, and in order to tap into the JTM resources, as all countries, Estonia needs to prepare the territorial just transition plan. Just a refresher, I'm not sure how aware you are of the mechanism, but the mechanism itself consists of three different pillars. The first of them, and the one that has most, the media talks most about, at least in Estonia, is the Just Transition Fund, which is meant for basically subsidies. And the areas of support under the Just Transition Fund are productive investments, mostly into SMEs, but also large enterprises can be considered. but mostly SMEs. So, and that includes micro enterprises, economic diversification, modernization, creation of new firms and jobs. Then research and innovation activities can be supported, professional development and retraining of employees. In the case of Estonia, of the oil shale sector. In other areas, it could be coal or gas or other. Certain activities in education and social integration are also accepted, and then also such broader topics as digitalization, energy efficiency, circular economy, and so on. And what is excluded from the JTF support, importantly, are the production, processing, distribution, storage, and combustion of fossil fuels, which obviously has how do I say, it makes it a little difficult for regions like Idaviru to think of, okay, what are we going to do if we've been focusing on fossil fuels so far, and now this is the only thing we cannot invest in, then so what are we going to do? So it has not been taken lightly by the local community. And also nuclear energy, importantly, is also excluded from the JTF support. In preparing our territorial just transition plan, with which we're kind of a little further than halfway into the development of it, what we've tried to do from the very start is to organize and implement a very comprehensive partnership. So on the national level, we have a steering committee, which is composed of different ministries, regional bodies, representatives of employees, employers, environmental organizations, universities, and so on. So the steering committee meets regularly to discuss the progress of us preparing the TJTP and to kind of steer us in the right direction. On the regional level, we also have a regional just transition platform, not the European one, but the regional, where you have even more stakeholders that can participate and voice their opinions about where we're going with the preparing of the plan. Sorry about that. Also, there are a bunch of soft networking structures involved. We've carried out public consultation activities and so on. So really, it's been a very broad process of outreach to figure out where we're going. And then as a result of this process, we've mapped three major development needs. First one, not surprisingly, is restructuring the economy with the view of diversifying it and creating new highly value-added jobs. The second development need is obviously supporting the people and the communities, not only the actual workers, but also the communities around them that are impacted by the transition process. So that includes reprofiling, labor mobility, skill development, social welfare net, let's say enhancement, active participation of the communities, and so on. And then the third development need, again, not surprisingly, is the alleviating of legacy environmental impacts that are related to mining of oil shale processing activities. So based on the outreach, based on the goals of the European of the JTF as a mechanism, and on the feedback that we've got from the community over the last almost year and a half, we've planned to split the JTF funds into two main programmatic strands. The first one deals with the biggest problem, or the biggest perceived problem in the region, which is restructuring and diversifying the economy and workforce. So the volume of this, let's say, programmatic strand is going to be 80% of the total allocation for Estonia. 20% is going to go into environmental and social inclusion, and that would include decoupling district heating from oil shale, alleviating environmental issues, supporting local initiatives, and so on and so forth. So, but two major strands, one of them is 80% because it's perceived as the biggest problem. The other one is smaller, not necessarily because it's perceived as a smaller problem, but rather because that strand is easier addressed through other funds. So we're not trying to solve all the problems in Idaviru with just one JTF. We're trying to be really specific about what are the unique things that we need to address with the JTF and what can be dealt with through complementary measures. One of the challenges, which I'm sure all the countries have noticed by now, is the time frame. The commitments, we need to be really fast with both taking up commitments of what we're going to do and also making payouts in the JTF. And so that is an actual challenge, because if we're talking about a region which has pretty limited absorption capacity for any sort of funds or any sort of activity, then this is going to be stretching it. But I think we'll be fine. We're not too worried just yet. So, but complexities of the JTF. Implementing the JTF is not just about spending some money, right? It's obviously it has to have an effect, a really specific effect, and also it has its own complexities that are not necessarily directly that cannot be directly addressed by the JTF itself, but they do need to be kept in mind. For example, I just kind of threw a bunch of questions here of what we have to keep in mind when we're developing the JTF here in Estonia. Is where were you? As asked by the previous oil shale sector employees. The transition, as I showed you, has been going on for years, but the JTF has just arrived. So the expectations are really high for this thing to actually work. This is who we are, leading people through grief over their past glory, the glory of the industrial sector that they worked in, and into a yet unclear future of sustainable economy and climate neutrality is not easy. Obviously, there is high risk of competition between both municipalities and stakeholders in the region. There are problems, or not problems, but there are, let's say, risks of how well are we going to be able to absorb both the funds and the philosophy behind the JTF in the region. What about us? Are asking the other regions in Estonia. So it's explaining why Ida-Viru is special, and obviously it is special, but we kind of need to highlight or remind ourselves and others about that all the time. That Ida-Viru didn't choose to have the oil shale sector. It just happened to be there, and now it didn't choose to have to phase it out. And this is what makes the region special in the case of Estonia. And also an interesting aspect is that it is a European initiative, both the JTF and the climate policy. Well, not only a European initiative, let's say it's a global initiative, obviously. But in this particular case, with the JTF and the climate policy that we have, we kind of have to balance the benefits and also the absorbing the shock of the climate policy in the region like Ida-Viru, which has to deal with it the hardest of the other regions. And so there are other numerous aspects as well, obviously. And I think this is where I'll end. I hope I made it on time. Thank you very much.